You believe in Jesus? Yes, I do. Well, you're going to meet him.
Creed, where we connect faith and reason to ordinary experience by steelmanning aspects of Christendom. Today, we will be continuing our discussion on God as Father. Joining me today, as always, is my good friend Nate.
Hello, Ian. Greetings, listeners, and greetings, fellow heretics. Looking forward to our continuing discussion.
Yes, our continuing discussion, where really I thought we would be doing like half-hour episodes on each of the clauses in the Creed. And yet here we are burning through time. So, just to recap what we did about last time.
Previously on X-Men.
The first episode of Season 3 is like, who cares about creeds? We talk about ritual as such. And then we get into the Apostles' Creed itself. And so we come to the first phrase, God is Father. So what does that mean? So we talked about what that meant in terms of, look, these ideas that you get from feminism that, the sexes are the same, there is no gender, patently false, as we demonstrated last time. But I think that a lot of our discussion from last time was fairly empirical in nature as opposed to theoretical in nature. And the reason why that matters, of course, is that when we're talking about, say, an is-ought dichotomy, at some point, you do have to address the theoretical, the ought, as opposed to the is that is observed. But the main point that I was trying to get across, at least, is that forget about, this is, you can't prove that. Who knows what's intended? It's like, okay, fine, never mind about any sort of ought. It's like, well, just look around, man. Do you really think that there is no difference between the genders? Do you really act as though there's no difference between the genders? And what we tried to demonstrate last time was that, it seems like there's a difference. So, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I do not.
All right, thank you. So now we do have to cross the line between from the is to the ought. And we talked about this a little last time, but I wanted to get into it a little bit more, if for nothing else, because I'm never going to resist the opportunity to rig David Hume over the coals. And so this comes to us from David Hume. So someone might reject what we said last time about gender and say, look, man, sure, that's how it happens to be. Maybe this is just what's going on.
I think they would say, look, they.
Yeah, look, they. Is pal gender neutral? Pal? Hey, pal.
Don't call me a rat, buddy. I'm not your buddy, friend. He's not your friend, guy. I'm not your guy, buddy. He's not your buddy, friend. I'm not your friend, guy.
I'm not your buddy, them.
I don't know.
They might say, well, look, you're being a bit myopic. I know you fellows aren't anthropologists. You haven't excavated all over the world. So your empiricism is, pedestrian at best. How are you going to move this from empirical observation into the ought category? It's like, okay, fair enough. And we discussed that a little bit last time, but I want to expand on that. And so, hey, look, we're not being slouches here. We're gonna take on sort of the best argument that we can find on this. And the fellow, to my knowledge, who really gets at this is David Hume. So we get to throw David Hume under the bus again. So he writes, this is David Hume, he says, in every system of morality which I have hitherto met with, so his clauses are ending in prepositions, which is no good way to start, I have always remarked that the author proceeds for some time in the ordinary way of reasoning and establishes the being of God or makes observations concerning human affairs, when of a sudden there are hooves on the roof. Now, when of a sudden I am surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations of propositions, which is just a great turn of phrase, is and is not, I meet with no proposition that is connected with an ought or an ought not.
Okay, so what is he even saying there?
Yeah, fair question. So the point that Hume's making is, so Hume's writing in the 1700s, and he's examining the works. He's opining on the works of the various philosophers of that time, and he's going, look, these fellows, they start off and they're going from, we start with empiricism, we observe A, B, and C. From that, we deduce this. If A and if B, then you get D, and then if you get D, that leads you to E, and then that leads you to F, and you just have this chain of syllogisms, or as he says, a copulation of propositions. And so, of course, what he means by that is a combining of the propositions. You've got this fact that leads you to this fact. And so, but the point is that you're starting with something which is an unimpeachable fact, right? You're starting with pure fact. You combine that with logic, you get to something else that can be deduced. And so everything is in the category, if you will, of is. But then he says, sorry, does that answer your question?
I think so.
Okay. What's your question? He says, this change is imperceptible, but is, however, of the last consequence.
So he's saying that the is not actually connected with an ought, saying like this is how it should be. So that weakens the
He's saying that a jump
proposition.
He's saying that a jump takes place. Okay, so so let's do an example. So one of the things that we learn, pretty much everybody learns in school, is everyone learns the Pythagorean theorem. Of course, both of our listeners probably have forgotten the Pythagorean theorem. So just to review, it's if you have a right triangle, if you look at the sides, you make the hypotenuse, that is to say the side opposite that of the 90-degree
The longer
angle.
side.
The longest side. Right. Is that there's actually an arithmetic relationship there, which is that a squared plus b squared equals c squared.
So the two shorter sides, when they're squared, added together, equal the third side squared.
Right. So
Okay.
that's a fact. That's the is, right? Mm-hmm. And so what he's saying is that you might observe that that property holds in all right triangles. You go, all well and good. So that's a fact, right? And then you move to, thus we should construct houses on the basis of that. And so you just move there from the is of, hey, look at this property of right triangles, to the ought of, thus we should construct our houses that way.
Okay.
I'm not saying you should or shouldn't, but that's a leap. Mm-hmm. Is that there really is no connection there. There's a, what would you say, a nominal connection. They both reference the Pythagorean theorem, but that you should build your house in that way, or really any way, has nothing to do with how the sides of a triangle relate to each other. So that's what he's about.
Okay.
And his point is that he says this change is imperceptible, but is, however, the last consequence. For as this ought, or ought not, whatever is expressed as a preposition, expresses some new relation or affirmation, it's necessary that it should be observed and explained, and at the same time that a reason should be given for what seems altogether inconceivable. How this new relation can be a deduction from others which are entirely different from it. But as authors do not commonly use this precaution, I shall presume to recommend it to the readers, and am persuaded that this small attention would subvert all the vulgar systems of morality, and let us see that the distinction of vice and virtue is not founded merely on the relations of objects, nor is perceived by reason.
Okay, I don't understand that either. So explain.
Sure. So what he's saying is that various authors, again in the 1700s, they go about, they observe this and that. They go, look, women seem pretty decent at rearing children, probably better than men. Look at that. Men are pretty decent in the coal mines and the factories, So that's an empirical observation. Mm-hmm. I don't think a lot of people are going to argue about that.
And the leap they're probably making is this is why women don't need property rights, because they just need to do, this is what they do, and so
I'm going to make a much more modest claim, which is that
I'm saying that's what people were doing in the 1700s.
Well, I don't know, so I'm not going to make that claim. I'm going to make a much more modest claim, which is that women seem better with children, men seem better in coal mines. Therefore, women ought to be with the kids, and men ought to be in the coal mines.
Fair enough. Okay.
And so that's his point, which is that you make this observation about how things seem to be in reality, the facts of the matter, and then you go, oh, this is how things ought to be. And I'm sympathetic to his point in a certain sense, right? Because I think that same point is sometimes made, or rather say was made, in defense of slavery, right? Is that you would make the argument that, look, some people, that is just their station in life. They're not very intellectual. They're not very attuned to what's going on. They're made to be laborers. You can observe that plainly. Therefore, they ought to be that, right? And so I don't disagree with his point. I disagree with his application of it.
And what is his application in this paragraph that you just read that you're disagreeing with?
Well, it's that, and this is what we ended with last time, which is that he's right in the strictest sense that you cannot derive an ought from an is.
Thanks.
I agree with him in the strictest, say, logical sense. But here's the thing. At this point, we have already made the case that this world is created by God. And so to expand on the things we discussed last time, if you know that an intelligence, a personality has created something, then because people act with intention, the is that people create is imbued with the ought that they desire.
So what we are doing with this show is setting up a copulation of propositions. That's what we're doing, right? And you're saying that's
among other things.
You're saying that's perfectly reasonable thing to do. And you're saying Hume is saying like no.
Well, what I'm saying is that Hume is correct in saying that an ought cannot be derived from an is. What Hume fails to recognize is that which is comes from a person. And persons have an ought because they have an aim. And therefore, if you include, so what Hume's working with, he's working with merely a set of facts. And what we're saying is, take that set of facts, but then include the fact that all of these facts that you see comes from a person.
Comes from an ought.
Comes from a person which has an ought
Okay.
within it. Because all humans, or all persons, act with an ought. And then all of a sudden, it goes away. The argument goes away. And so, therefore, it's perfectly reasonable to take what we observed last time about the is of gender and try to extrapolate it into an ought. That's the argument. And so the example I think I gave last time, but I'll reiterate now, is that suppose I come to your house and you're not home for whatever reason. I don't know. You're like, Ian, come over and
Take care of the cat.
take care of the cat. Yeah, we're on vacation. Take care of the cat. Now, so far, I think this is true. So far in our communications, you've never told me never to jump on your couch or to go upstairs and have a pillow fight with an imaginary friend or whatever. You've never told me these things. And yet, somehow, when I enter your house, I recognize, should I jump on the couch with my shoes on?
Should I raid the fridge?
Should I raid the fridge? Yeah. I don't think so. Why is that? Do I deduce that from the refrigerator? Is there something intrinsic to Whirlpool which tells me not to eat the contents therein? No. It's that the Whirlpool is there because it was put there by Nate. And I got a decent understanding of Nate, or at least I think I do, sufficient to make me go, probably shouldn't eat all the contents therein. And so, yes, there is a fact. There is an is. Yes, you cannot derive an ought from an is. But there is an additional fact that the is that is comes from a personality which has an ought. Does that make sense?
I'm tracking.
All right. Based on that, what should then be the ought? And I think the best illustration of this, as far as I can tell, comes from Perelandra,
Which is a book by C.S. Lewis.
yes, which I believe we've referenced previously. But have you gone through it yet in
Yeah.
totality? Okay, so you have gone through it now.
I read it a couple months ago.
Okay,
The whole trilogy.
all right, right on.
This is a fictional space trilogy that C.S. Lewis wrote.
Yes,
Science fiction, I guess.
I don't understand why we're trying to like resurrect. I mean, like, don't get me wrong. I'm a big fan of Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and all that good stuff. But like, look, space trilogy. It's only 3 books. It's not 7. That's less of a commitment. Why can't we have those movies? Where's Peter Jackson when you need him?
Did you hear that the Netflix Chronicles of Narnia is? Oh yeah, I probably texted you guys about that.
Well, it wasn't just you. I've heard it from multiple sources.
Yeah, not gonna engage.
Yeah.
So.
Anyway, but seriously, like, but I just don't get it. Like, it's 3 movies. Like, you could make a boatload of money if you just did it right. You know who needs to do it? This is actually a decent question for you. Have you? Okay, so first of all, are you aware of Fellowship? Shoot, it's the guy. It's Max McLean. It's the guy who does Fellowship of Performing Arts. It's the guy who does all the C.S. Lewis stuff. He takes the books, he makes screenplays out of them for the stage, and then like performs them. Are you familiar with this?
No, I'm not.
Gee whiz, dude. Okay, I'll have to hook you up after the show. But so, did you not see? So back in 21 or 22, they took his stage show of The Most Reluctant Convert, and it was like in theaters for like. It's like when you and I went and saw.
It's like Fathom event type deal, where
Yeah.
Okay.
What did we see 2 years ago? The child trafficking thing.
Yeah, that wasn't a Fathom event though. It wasn't like a this weekend in theaters.
Yeah.
Go and watch this live.
It's
play
like that.
gets broadcast.
Okay. It's like it was like that.
Okay.
It's really good stuff. Anyway, check that out. But that needs to be on the big screen. I'm going on in length about this, but Perelandra is like really. It's such a cool book. It's such a cool book, and it ends with just such a tight scene. All right, I won't get into it because I don't want to ruin it for our 2 listeners. But so anyway, in Perelandra, so what happens is to set it up is that Perelandra is Venus. Venus consists of, because of course, what would you say? Astronomically, it's obscured by clouds, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So, what's that? The second Pink Floyd record, I think, obscured by clouds. And the character from Out of the Silent Planet, Ransom, goes there, does this and that. And at the end of the book, so I've sloughed over a lot of details, but the most important thing is that the planet is untouched by sin. So this is that Earth is clearly touched by sin. The book is not, or the planet is not. And now he's viewing what would be the equivalent of Adam and Eve on the planet. And this is what he writes. He says, both the bodies were naked, and both were free from any sexual characteristics.
He's not looking at the Adam and Eve character. He's looking at Mars and Venus. He's saying Mars and Venus were both naked, and they were both free from any sexual characteristics because they're angels, either primary or secondary.
I guess it's hard. Okay, well, it's hard to say in my mind. Like, it becomes blurred at that point. The characters versus their representations.
No. There's the Adam and Eve character,
The king and queen.
king and queen.
Yeah.
And then there's Mars and Venus.
Am I misremembering this?
I think you most certainly are.
Okay.
There's the king and queen of Venus, who are humanoid, and they most certainly have sexual characteristics. But Mars and Venus show up at the end. And the other thing with the space trilogy, because the first episode takes place on Mars, second episode on Venus, the third on Earth. The idea is that the way that the god of the story set it up is each planet has their own chief angel, essentially, who's
Right.
in charge of shepherding that Earth. And the reason Earth is called the silent planet is because Lucifer has rebelled. So there's no interactions between the other planets and Earth because Lucifer's in the doghouse. Permanently, I guess you would say.
So it would seem.
So Venus in this mythology, I guess you could say, is the younger planet. And so they
Yes.
kind of have their temptation moment.
Everything on Mars at this point is stone and
it's old.
Yeah.
But so the character, the human characters, the Adam and Eve equivalent on Venus, endure their temptation during the course of the book.
Right.
And at the end of the book, obviously they make it through, but in the last scene, the Mars angel and the Venus angel show up together to kind of, celebrate, thank Ransom for his help, etc.
Ransom being the character from the first book.
The human character.
Who came from Earth, went to Mars, and
Yeah.
now has gone to Venus.
Yes. So anyway, this reference is to the quote you're talking about is when Venus and Mars are hanging out, they're there together.
Okay, gotcha. At all events, Ransom saw at that moment was the real meaning of gender. Everyone must sometimes have wondered why in nearly all tongues certain inanimate objects are masculine and others are feminine. So we talked about this last time, right? Which is that book is masculine and house is feminine in Spanish. What is masculine about a mountain or feminine about certain trees? Ransom has cured me. So very briefly.
The narrator.
The narrator, right? Me is the narrator there. Ransom has cured me of believing that this is a purely morphological phenomenon depending on the form of the word. Still less is a gender and imaginative extension of sex. Our ancestors did not make mountains masculine because they projected male characteristics into them. The real process is the reverse. Gender is a reality and a more fundamental reality than sex. Sex is, in fact, merely the adaptation to organic life of a fundamental polarity that divides all beings.
Yeah, I think that's a great paragraph.
Yeah, and
if we thought more that way, it would help our society out a lot.
Well, it took me a while to think through this because I'll refrain from commenting until we come to the next quote later. But one of the primary questions generally is what's primary and what's secondary. I mean, and that's true of so many things in life, right? So, for instance, like, okay, you need to go out and make money so you can support your family. Is making money the primary focus of your life? Is that the first thing that you should be doing? It's like, well, no, that's in service to loving my wife and children, right? It's like, well, you should be in shape. Okay, well, is going to the gym my primary focus? Like, well, no, that serves something else, right? So it's a question of what's primary and what is secondary. And so the argument that we've made thus far, because we were arguing from the is that the is that we can see is sex, which is penis and vagina. It's what you observe and then what's correlated with those things. That's the argument we've made thus far. But the argument that Lewis is making is in fact the opposite of that, which is that no, there's actually a fundamental reality that precedes sex, of which sex is a consequence. That fundamental reality is gender. That's his argument. And his rationale for that, empirically, at least in this particular passage, is that, look, you actually see it imbued in language, for instance, which is part of the argument that we made last time. And so what he's saying is that although we would say, because it's so readily apparent that sex is primary and then certain things are correlated to it, no, actually, it's that gender is primary and sex is a consequence.
Great.
And so he continues to write, female sex is simply one of the things that have feminine gender. There are many others, and masculine and feminine meet us on planes of reality where male and female would simply be meaningless. And so what he means by that is that male and female, as he uses them there, are sexed, right? Male possessing male genitalia, female possessing female genitalia. And yet, even in the absence of genitalia, you still observe masculine and feminine. Masculine, so he continues, masculine is not attenuated male, nor is feminine attenuated female. On the contrary, the male and female of organic creatures are rather faint and blurred reflections of masculine and feminine. Their reproductive functions, their differences in strength and size, partly exhibit, but also partly confuse and misrepresent the real polarity. And so then how do you synthesize this? And this is something else that we said last time, but we'll expand on this time, which is that when we talk about ordinate masculinity, we are talking about that consists of the actions and characteristics intended by God exclusively for males. And so we had previously said, if you're just going to go with the pure is, because that's what you have to start. If you're going to go with the pure is who's got a penis and what do they do, roughly, right? And then you can fix subsets of time and space and say this masculine here and there. And similarly for femininity. But really, you need to take as your ontic referent the opposite, which is what does God intend? And those things which God intends exclusively for males, that's your ordinate masculinity. And the things that he intends exclusively for females, that's your ordinate femininity. And sex is the biological reality. Gender is the set of intended actions and characteristics.
I think, we're going to get into this a little bit deeper too. Sin clouds this whole thing. And that gets back to the theology of the body stuff I think we mentioned a little bit at the end last time.
Right.
We have this problem where it should be very obvious we're created in the image of God as human beings. We have a special role in the physical world, unlike, our sexual union has a much higher meaning than the sexual union of a cat in God's eyes, because
Sure.
when we're doing that, we're actually imaging God. But since sin has clouded that whole situation, it muddies the waters and creates these situations where we look at something like biological sex and try to separate it from its purpose, which then makes confusion with the whole I can pick my gender thing.
Sure.
So, anyway.
Right. Well, that's the thing with the I can pick my gender thing. It's like, no, you can't.
Your gender is way more, what would you say, fundamental to you than your genitalia.
Yeah.
And cutting off your genitalia or trying to morph your body into something it was never intended to be does not change your gender, no matter how much you want it to.
Well, it's again, because your gender is what's intended in the mind of God. And so your genitalia is a consequence of what's intended, but it's not the totality of it. And so that's why it's so important to understand what's primary and what's secondary. The reason why that's important is because if, again, to put in the forefront what the whole point of these talks is that if we're trying to understand what it means to talk about God as Father, we said last time that Father is a subset of husband, which is a subset of male or masculine, but we're not talking about genitalia. It doesn't make sense to talk about that, and so there needs to be some ontic referent prior to something like that. So I think fairly clearly, God is Father and the Holy Spirit. They're not sexed beings, and so what does it mean then to speak of them as or to speak of God as Father? What we're speaking of then is we're speaking of a mode of being or a mode of relationship. And that's what we're trying to promulgate here.
Yeah, so if you just get to the creed themselves. So just real quick before we get into the why does this creed even here, or why is this clause in the creed? As a male, what you're doing is you're seeding something, right? You're
SEED.
Yes, SEED.
Not CEDE.
No, you're planting something, And the feminine, you're nurturing something, right?
Right.
And so this is the part of the important reason that this is in the creed is this important part of that God is essentially seeding the world with life, with structure and all that type of stuff. So how did we get this threefold formula at the beginning of the creed? Got some references here. Most of these references come from a book from 1938 called The History of the Creeds by Francis Badcock. This is from page 126 in his book. The first two in the last three clauses, why did they come about? And the most probable answer to this question would be as a safeguard against heresy. So if we then ask from what heresies the early Church of Rome suffered, because remember the Apostles' Creed is generally the creed from the Church in Rome, is the names are like the Marcion heresy, and some other heresies, Praxis, Notus, Sibelius. All these heresies were of a Gnostic character, and there were 3 points on which they differed from the Church of Rome, which in common with the Church in Africa. They knew one God, the creator of the universe, and Jesus Christ from the Virgin Mary, the Son of God, the Creator, and the resurrection of the flesh. So, to assert the creatorship of God, one of the words was added in the first clause may have been Father. But this may have been added to the baptismal formula much earlier. It might have come specifically from the Lord's Prayer. It might have come from ordinary Christian usage, imitating the Lord's regular method of address. Ye received the spirit of adoption, whereby we cry, Abba, Father. If ye call him on the name of the Father, or it might have come in from the blending of the Matthean formula from the book of Matthew with that already in use. But in early Christian writings, it was also employed metaphorically of God as the source from whom all things proceeded. So the reason, God the Father is clearly language that is used by Jesus and used in the New Testament. But this became very important in the 2nd century, like 100 years after the Gospels were written, to combat these Gnostic heresies. And so one of the primary reasons that God is portrayed as a father in these early Christian writings was because he was the source from which all these things proceeded. So kind of like Clement said, God is the father and creator of the whole world, the maker and father of the ages. Justin Martyr references these types of things. I have some Latin here because this Badcock guy it's a academic work. So he just.
But before you get to the Latin, I do have a question for you because it just occurred to me when you were talking about this stuff. In the Old Testament, is there a lot? Are there a lot of references to God as Father?
I don't think so.
I don't think there are. Like I'm just doing like a quick review in my head. Like I feel like that's something that is more New Testament. We'll say on balance.
Well, and we can say, I mean, that type of thing. If you look at the character of God in the Old Testament, definitely has the same character.
Oh yeah,
this using this language as Father. It's kind of like the idea of we didn't start using the word Trinity until the year 250.
Sure,
that didn't make it not true, And
right.
I think kind of acknowledging God as Father was pretty unique to. I think that is unique to the New Testament. But it's
that
just
level of explicit articulation. I don't think was because I feel like in the Old Testament for the most part he was Almighty, Lord of hosts, Lord of armies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So like Irenaeus calls him the Father, the universal Father, and if Father was already present in the formula or was thought by itself insufficient, then Almighty could be added to it. So Novitian, he's a 3rd century priest in Rome. He was a theologian. Actually, kind of a controversial figure. Read his Wikipedia page. But anyway, he's quoting this quote I'm going to read. He's quoting from what he is calling the rule of truth, and we've talked about the rule of truth. There's this common faith that's handed down from the apostles. There's no doubt that he personally holds to the common Catholic faith, but it's impossible to learn from his language the text of the Roman Creed. So when he's writing this theological treatise, it's unclear whether he's quoting the creed or what he's doing. But what he says is the rule of truth itself demands that, first of all, we should believe in God the Father and the Lord Almighty. That is, the most perfect creator of all things. The same rule of truth teaches us to believe that after the Father in the Son of God, Christ Jesus our Lord, but the Son of God. And I have another quote from a different translation of this that says, "The rule of truth requires us that we should first of all things believe on God the Father and the Lord omnipotent, that is the absolutely perfect founder of all things, who has suspended the heavens in lofty sublimity, has established the earth with its lower mass, has diffused the seas with their fluent moisture, and has distributed all these things, both adorned and supplied, with their appropriate and fitting instruments. For in the solid vault of heaven he has both awakened the light-bringing sunrisings, he has filled up the whole white globe of the moon in its monthly waxings as a solace for the night. He has moreover kindles the starry rays with the very splendors of glistening light, and he has willed all these things into their legitimate tracks to circle the entire compass of the world, so as to cause days, months, years, signs and seasons, and benefits of other kinds for the human race." Now, why would I read all of that language? And it's very poetic. But the point is a woman doesn't do this. That's the point.
Sure.
That's why God is Father.
Yeah.
And so God as Father is perfectly married with God as Creator. And so that's why it's super important. And that's, why we don't have Mother Earth. If Mother Earth was a real deity, she would nurture us and kind of help us out. But that's not what God the Father is doing.
Well, I would also remind you of, I think it is Tennyson, although if I'm wrong, we'll correct it in the show notes, that nature is red in tooth and claw. So Mother Earth is
vicious,
at once beautiful and at the same time terrible. Which, in her credit, we acknowledged last time, right? I think that was kind of the point of what Peterson wrote in his summary of both the masculine and feminine, is that both are magnificent, terrible in their own ways.
And I guess I kind of glossed over this, but those Gnostic heresies essentially taught that the God of the Old Testament was evil, and that there wasn't this omnipotent God in charge of everything, which is obviously what the Christians were combating with these, and this is where this thought about God the Father kind of came from, or why it got so explicitly stated.
The God of the Old Testament, that's a phrase that needs stricken from the language. The God of the Old Testament is right up there with when people, we'll say romantically engaged, refer to their opposite as my partner. That needs to be stricken from the lexicon. It's right up there with God of the Old Testament. Both of those things are heresies. So first of all, my apologies to you, Nate. I feel like this show would be a lot better if you replaced me with an LLM that you just fed in all of the works of Lewis and Chesterton, and then you replaced my voice with a very intellectual sounding British fellow, and then this program would be so much better.
Okay.
Because really all I do is I just read Lewis and Chesterton and go, yeah, I agree with those guys.
I think that's still useful.
Maybe I'll replace you with an LLM.
Now,
I'll just feed a bunch of books of history.
So we've talked.
It'll be one LLM talking to another, and you and I will be getting drunk off to the side.
Okay, so hopefully all our haranguing across these two episodes, hopefully we're making an impression that it's important to view God as masculine.
Yeah.
And how does that inform action in the real world? Well, it also informs action with how we operate in our religion, because if we're trying to interact with God, then we have to do that through religion. Some people would say that you don't, but that's okay.
Yeah.
And so
we handled that one episode earlier.
Yeah. So now we're kind of coming to the point where it's like, okay, well, how do I approach God now?
Right.
And why does there's proper ways to do that and improper ways to do that, and actually, and there's roles for us as humans, So I'm interested. I'm just trying to set up your next point.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, set up, layup. Okay, so bump, set, spike. The
sports terms from Ian. Wow.
Oh my goodness. I too am a fan of sports ball. How do you do, fellow kids? So this comes to us from Lewis's Priestesses in the Church. Sorry, it's an interrogative. Priestesses in the Church. Got to put the upswing at the end there. Now, I alluded to this earlier, but I have to admit, when did I first encounter this? 2016, when I was going through his essay collection, I went through this and I went, I don't think so. Like, I went through this essay, I just couldn't get on board with it because I, at the time, I still have very egalitarian proclivities. So, like, egalitarianism just in general, that's my default, right? It's like, until there's some obvious reason why that shouldn't be the case, my default.
Is this just because you're hot for Ayn Rand, or is it your libertarianism?
Have you seen Ayn Rand?
Yeah, it was a joke. It was a bad joke.
For goodness sakes, that's the real reason that I hate Keynes, the economist Keynes. Is that he married like this beautiful Russian ballerina, and he's just like some nerd. He's some economist nerd, and yet he gets this Russian ballerina. And meanwhile, I have to read Ayn Rand, and the whole thing's just a disaster. But anyway, so I read Priestesses in the Church, and I go, maybe I kind of see where you're coming from. But then 8-9 years pass, and I go, no. I see what he's getting at, and it goes right in line with what we're saying here. So the whole point of this is that, when is this written? This is written in like the early.
You have 1948 40s. Here.
Well, that's when it's published.
Okay.
Like I'm trying to differentiate when it's published versus when it's written. It's written in the 30s or 40s. Okay, Lewis is Anglican, and so the Anglicans are going, hey. How about Priestesses? And so he writes an essay in response to that. And so this is part of it. He says, at this point, the common sensible reformer is apt to ask, why? Why? Tell me why ain't nothing but a party. If women can preach, they cannot do all the rest of the priest's work. This question deepens the discomfort on my side. We begin to feel that what really divides us from our opponents, so that's Lewis speaking there, as someone who's like, no, I kind of feel like priests should still be dudes, but I'm not quite sure why. But I really feel like they should. So that's Lewis's standpoint. We begin to feel that what really divides us from our opponents, so the opponents here are the people who are saying, everyone can be a priest, is a difference between the meaning which they and we give to the word priest. The more they speak, and speak truly about the competence of women in administration, their tact and sympathy as advisors, their national talent for visiting, the more we feel that the central thing is being forgotten. To us, a priest is primarily a representative, a double representative who represents us to God and God to us. Our very eyes teach us this in church. Sometimes the priest turns his back on us and faces east. He speaks to God for us. Sometimes he faces us and speaks to us for God. We have no objection to a woman doing the first, that is to say, so this is me inserting parenthetically, speaking to God for us. The whole difficulty is about the second. But why? Why should a woman in this sense represent, or why should a woman not in this sense represent God? Certainly not because she is necessarily or even probably less holy or less charitable or stupider than a man. In that sense, she may be as godlike as a man, and a given woman much more so than a given man. And thus, C.S. Lewis acknowledges the difference between means and observations. The sense in which she cannot represent God will perhaps be plainer if we looked at the thing the other way around.
All right, let's do a quick summary here.
Yeah. So what he's saying is, like, look, the priest has roughly two functions. One is that he's representing us to God, and the other is that he's representing God to us. And this goes back sacramentally to the Jews, right? When you read through, and in fact, where am I right now? I'm in Numbers right now in my daily readings. Not what you're up to. And so, like, man, I'm knee deep in all of the kashrut law and everything that attends it. And it's very clear that there is a certain pageantry that's taking place. I don't think anyone's going to deny that. If you look at all the offerings, like the wave offerings and whatnot, it's like, who cares if you slaughter a dove? Like, what good is that in some sort of literal sense? But then in a symbolic sense, this is the argument that we made with ritual, right? It's a reminder, remember, remember, remember. And so I think what Lewis is saying here is that going back to the start of that, when he writes, we begin to feel that what really divides us from our opponents is a difference between the meaning which we give to the word priest. And so I think in Lewis's mind, the meaning that the people advocating, say, for priestesses give to the word priest is that it's mere symbolism. Who cares? And it can be fulfilled at once by a male as a female. And I think what Lewis is saying here is that no, there's something beyond mere symbolism. There's something that is embodied, and that's missing when you have a female versus a male.
Yeah, I mean, I'll add my 2 cents in here, and we're probably going to, tread into waters a little bit outside the subject of our episode. But, the primary job of a priest was to offer sacrifices. And in Christian worship, we have an altar and we have a priest. I wonder what we're doing up there. We're offering a sacrifice. And really what we're doing is Christ is giving himself to us in Christian worship. And Christ is our spouse. He's the husband. And Christ, or the church, is his wife. And if you have a woman representing a man, and you're not just representing the man, but anyway.
Well, but that's the whole point about modes of being.
Yeah.
Right? Is that there's a mode of being which is masculine, there's a mode of being which is feminine. Mm-hmm. And so to have the feminine represent the masculine mode of being, everyone looks at that and immediately goes, no.
And I would say sacraments are also a physical manifestation of a spiritual reality.
Yes.
Kind of the same way that sex is a manifestation of gender, which is spiritual. So you could say, in this analogy, that gender is spiritual, and sex is the physical manifestation of it.
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the sacraments are the exact same way.
Right.
Especially, the primary one. So...
Well, and that goes back to Exodus, right? Like the sacrifice that takes place, the Passover sacrifice is very physical. All right, unleavened cakes, bitter herbs, slaughter the lamb, eat it, and then blood over the doorposts, right? Like it wasn't merely like we're gonna offer up a prayer and hope that things go well. It's like, no. You're going to do very specific things. You're going to embody something which is indicative of a bigger reality. And that's the argument that Lewis is making in Perelandra, which is that sex is the embodiment of a greater reality. And then applying that logic to, what would you say, ecclesiastical station is what gives rise to his argument in this essay.
Yeah. Well, let's keep going to the essay. I think I not undermine. What's the word? I think I jumped the gun. Anyway, let's just keep going.
Yeah. So he continues and he writes, suppose the reformers stop saying that a good woman may be like God, and begin saying so he's trying to draw out the what's going on here, right? In the same way, like any good interlocutor, right, goes, well, if you think that's true, how about this other situation? You'll argue by analogy, right? So that's what Lewis is doing here. He says, suppose the reformers stop saying that a good woman may be like God and begin saying that God is like a good woman. It's very funny to me. Suppose he says that we might just as well pray to our mother, which art in heaven, as to our Father. Suppose he suggests that the incarnation might just as well have taken a female as a male form, and the second person of the Trinity be as well called the daughter as the son. Suppose finally that the mystical marriage were reversed, that church were the bridegroom and Christ the bride. All this, as it seems to me, is involved in the claim that a woman can represent God as a priest does.
Yeah, I mean that's a great. I obviously agree with this argument wholeheartedly.
I'm curious. Did you? I'm not trying to call you up publicly, but here we are. Had you read this essay prior to this?
No.
Okay.
This portion of it that you put it in here is the first I read it.
Yeah. It well, like I said earlier, like I encountered this before I encountered Perelandra. It might have been even before, because like last time, you know how I told you I came with my way to specify what's masculine, what's feminine. Like even that idea, I don't know if that occurred to me prior or after this. Yeah. Again, I'm very disdainful of my of the generations before us for not making this clear. We had to rediscover this, like rediscovering the periodic table of elements. But yeah, I think his point is well taken, right? Which is that just like the whole point of the show is we look through everything through the lens of action. I sincerely ask the listener to consider the phrase God is Father and God is Mother. And just ask yourself honestly, by yourself, no one has to know. Does each phrase elicit the same response? Does it elicit the same feeling? Do you feel the same way of God as Father versus God as Mother? And if the answer is no, then just ask yourself why. And I think what you'll observe is that under and beneath and behind all the egalitarianism that has been promulgated in our society, you know that there's a difference. So Lewis continues. Now it is surely the case that if all these supposals were ever carried into effect, we should embark on a different religion. So he's saying, look, you embody this, you get something different. Goddesses have, of course, been worshipped. Many religions have had priestesses, but they are religions quite different in character from Christianity. Common sense disregarding the discomfort or even the horror which the idea of turning all our theological language into the feminine arouses in most Christians will ask, why not? Which, by the way, I'm not saying that feelings are everything, but they're something. So when your feelings are going, I don't know, this kind of goes back to when we were talking about the least worst life, right? Like if your feelings are rebelling against you, it's like, well, you should at least think about it for a second. Since God is in fact not a biological being and has no sex, what can it matter whether we say he or she, father, mother, son, or daughter? But Christians think God himself has taught us how to speak of him, which he has. To say that it does not matter is to say either that all the masculine imagery is not inspired, is merely human in origin, or else that, though inspired, it is quite arbitrary and unessential. And this is surely intolerable, or if tolerable, is an argument not in favor of Christian priestesses, but against Christianity. And so I think the reason why he makes that statement is that, well, gee whiz, it's all over. It's all over the language and speech of Christ. It's all over the New Testament. So to disregard it, it's like, it seems like you're throwing out a lot. Mm-hmm. It is also surely based on a shallow view of imagery. Without drawing upon religion, we know from our poetical experience that image and apprehension cleave closer together than common sense is here prepared to admit. That a child who has been taught to pray to a mother in heaven would have a religious life radically different from that of a Christian child. So, again, the whole point of the show, through the lens of action, are you telling me that if you raise a child to say our mother in heaven versus our father in heaven, that on average they turn out the same? No one believes that. So he concludes with, I think, the true climax of it, which is only one wearing the masculine uniform. And again, in his mind, masculinity is what's primary. Gender is primary, sex is secondary. Only one wearing the masculine uniform can represent the Lord to the church. For we are all corporately and individually feminine to him.
Yeah, I agreed with that.
And so it's like, well, fellas, what do you mean by that? Well, what we had expressed previously is that if gender is to have any meaning, it has to be in the context of a mode of being or a mode of relating. It's not merely physical. It's not genitalia. It's not sex. And so 4 passages present themselves. So we'll start with Revelation 19:7 and 8. And it says, let's rejoice and be glad and give glory to him, because the marriage of the Lamb has come and his bride has prepared herself. It was given to her to clothe herself in fine linen, bright and clean, for the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints. The church is feminine. Again, Revelation 21:1 and 2. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth passed away. There is no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. So what does all this mean in practice? Ephesians 5:22 through 33. Wives, subject yourselves to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is also the head of the church, he himself being the Savior of the body. But as the church is subject to Christ, so also the wives ought to be to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church, and gave himself up for her, so that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. So husbands also ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are parts of his body. For this reason a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is great, but I am speaking with reference to Christ and the church. Nevertheless, as for you individually, each husband is to love his own wife as himself. The wife must see to it that she respects her husband. And finally, Hebrews 12:4 through 13. You have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood in your striving against sin, and you have forgotten the exhortation which is addressed to you as sons. My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor faint when you are punished by him. For whom the Lord loves, he disciplines, and he punishes every son whom he accepts. It is for discipline that you endure. God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? But if you are without discipline, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate children, not sons. Furthermore, we have had earthly fathers to discipline us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time as seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our own good, so that we may share his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems to not be pleasant, but painful. Yet to those who have been trained by it, afterwards it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. And so what do we see in these passages? What we see is the outlaying of a mode of behavior, a mode of relationship. And thus we see masculinity, that is to say gender, founded or embedded in a foundation which is relating and being, as opposed to sexed and physical. And so, with respect to the male, what can you deduce? And one is giver and initiator, which is what you see in husband and father, which is that The man pursues, the woman
receives,
and the woman receives. The male provides the seed, the woman receives it. And we receive as God pursues us. God is the initiator. That's Genesis 1. God is the initiator. We left, we sinned. But the Bible doesn't end in Genesis 3. God pursues us. And we receive his blessing. God as protector. God as shield. The husband and father protects his wife, protects his children, and God himself shields us from total sin. So, for instance, if you think about Romans 1, right, which is the idea of roughly what hell is, God giving us up to our own sin and temptation, that could be the end of the story, but it's not. God provides a way out. Provider, God provides what is necessary to flourish. Trees bear their fruit. Animals can be skinned and used for clothing and can be used for meat. God is discipliner and sanctifier. So what are you doing with discipline? Well, when a child acts up, what you're saying with your discipline is, look, you're doing this. Don't do that anymore. That's not what you ought to be doing. You ought to be doing this other thing. And so what is that? That's a redirection of the action, the activity of the child toward that which is ordinate, toward that which is by design. And I think that what occurs in all of this is that the interaction between the masculine and the feminine is what creates. In order to receive, one must give. If one is to give, one must receive. And for whatever reason, and again, this is to a certain extent addressed in Perelandra, this whole thing is really just a commercial for Perelandra. There seems to be, I'm curious what you think about this, dude. There seems to be this idea in modernity where receipt is weak and to be disdained, and to give is strong and to be lauded. But both are necessary. And when the masculine and the feminine unite, when that which gives and that which receives comes together, that's what creates, and both are necessary.
Yeah, I mean, I think from the feminist perspective, that the idea that a man can provide me or offer me something that I could be dependent on him for, even almost specifically sperm. I don't need a man to have a child and raise a child, and that being the most obvious example between sex and gender,
right,
of modern feminism. And then I think for men, as far as giving, I wouldn't necessarily say it's seen as strength. I think a lot of men have given themselves over to the idea of self-gratification.
Sure.
So the idea that the male body is really, the only point is to go get as much gratification as you can get. So like we grew up.
Sow your wild oats.
Yeah. So like the early, like you said, the 90s and the early aughts, man, it was just all hyper, the guys just like hypersexual focus and, just go get yours. Right. So I wouldn't say that giving is seen as strength. I feel like we've kind of, and humans have always been like this. And the problem is that we've taken this thing that used to be, our society has agreed on and turned it into inflection point and kind of opened up the jury again on it. But I think there's just so much selfishness going on. Not only do we not want to receive, women don't want to receive, men don't want to give.
Don't want to give.
They just don't want to give. So
yeah, it's interesting to me. One of the, what's the right way to say this? The way social media algorithms work, right, is they feed you. It's self-referential, right? It's like you look at something so you get more of it, that sort of thing. I don't know what this says about me. Maybe I hate everybody. I get a lot of battle of the sexes stuff on my feed on Twitter, and part of it is just like what's so interesting to me about it is that on Twitter, at least, it's like both sides, as it were, are just like fully venting their irritation. Like the women are like, well, what about this? And the guys are like, well, what about that? My proclivity, my affinity is like, well, what are you going to do about it? And my answer is, I think a lot of this episode and the previous one, for obvious reasons, since we're both dudes, has focused more on the masculine side of things. But really, that's my answer. Is that like, well, I can't control ladies, but I can control myself. And so at this point, I'm very uninterested in whose fault it is, to why things are the way they are. My encouragement to people is start acting in an ordinate fashion.
Yeah, and not to be the wet blanket, but don't ignore the proper order of things.
Right.
And especially like if you're a religious person, don't do that, because it's kind of a FO situation.
Right.
Like if you're gonna end up like the the Anglican Church in the UK.
Well,
on a corporate level, but then on a personal level, you're gonna have to end up in despair.
Well, that's the thing is that like on a personal level, it's like we know where this goes.
Yeah.
That's why we have that. I mean, in a certain sense, like it's a caricature, it's a joke. So like in the early 1900s, right, we would call them spinsters, but today we would call them cat ladies. Right? Or not wine moms, like the childless wine aunt, right? The childless wine aunt of today is the spinster of the early 1900s. It's what they are. It's the same caricature put forward. I don't know what the equivalent would be for, the incel, right? Or the guy who's playing video games at 47 years of age, looking at pornography 2 hours a night, or like whatever, like that guy, like, but it's the same thing, right? It's like inordinate, in despair. Gender war, I don't know, but what I do know is God's created you for a purpose. Fulfill that purpose.
Yeah, and God didn't create the sexes to be at war with each other.
No.
You can choose to not listen to Andrew Tate. Like you can choose not to engage that. I feel like if you disengage a lot of stuff, the internet is great from the perspective of you can quickly get access to everything that you need.
Yeah.
You can also be quickly indoctrinated or influenced by, things. So,
yeah, just this evening I was doing tutorials in natural language processing.
Yep.
While watching Andrew Tate. No.
Yeah. While listening to Andrew Tate podcast.
While listening to Andrew Tate podcast.
So you don't have to hate women and vice versa. You don't have to hate men.
Right.
And you don't have to hate yourself. That's another. I mean, that's my biggest one with this conversation is you don't have to hate yourself.
But you do have to hate Nate.
So.
Well, just a few ideas to wrap this up. Like, as I was putting the notes together for this, like we just said, we have to. I think there's a lot of value in just accepting the gender roles. You might say, well, that doesn't apply to me. There's this one exception. Okay, fine. But start there at least, right? Start, if you're a lady, volunteer in the nursery, make food for people. You don't have to do that your whole life. It's a starting point, though. If you're a male, lift weights, prepare yourself to provide for a family.
And mow the grass at church. Because they need help with mowing the grass.
That might not be you for all eternity, but it's a starting point. But as I was preparing for this, it really did occur, it finally occurred to me what's been irritating me for so long about the church, which is that we embody a gender duality. And that's because to God, we are feminine, but to women, we're masculine.
So you're saying women have it easier than men?
I am saying that. I'm totally saying that. I don't care about the hate mail. But
it's true, though.
It's true, though. No one listens. But
no, I mean what you're saying is true.
I know you are. But I didn't get that for years. It always bothered me. Like all of the songs we sing in church, they're also like, "Oh, Jesus is my boyfriend." It's like I understand why dudes don't want to do that. It's like, why don't dudes come to church? It's because it's so feminized. Like, why is it so feminized? Why is it so feminized? I never thought about it. I never understood it until I prepared the notes for this episode. I'm being so serious. And I realized that part of acknowledgement of this means that we as men have to make a concerted effort to not let the church in its practice become overly feminine. We have to make a concerted effort to, if you will, hold high the banner of masculinity. Because sort of naturally, because we're feminine to God, and women are feminine to God, without that, we will simply have a bunch of songs of Jesus is my boyfriend.
Well, and I mean, my favorite Christian album is Faith Plus One. Are you familiar with this band?
I am not.
Okay. Lead singer Eric Cartman. And I mean, just listen to this track list. I found Jesus with someone else. Save yourself. And sometimes, like you said, guys go to church and they can't hack.
Well, so very briefly, I don't know if I've even had this guy. I think I might have had this conversation with you a few times, but when I was 18 years of age, no, strike that, 17 years of age, I discovered the band Manowar, and the first song I heard, I was like, this is the most awesome thing I've ever heard in my life. Because Eric Adams has a great set of pipes. I will put him up against anybody. He's sort of like the unsung vocal master. And if you look at their album covers, it's all just like this. It's Conan the Barbarian. It's a muscular, shirtless dude, lightning in the background, right? And then I discovered Pantera. My favorite record of theirs is called Vulgar Display of Power. And the cover of it is a guy getting punched in the face. It's like, why does that resonate with me? And why is church so weak? And the answer is because, at least in my experience, I don't think the churches I have attended have stewarded the spirit of masculinity appropriately. And so my only injunction or admonition to Christian churches is steward the spirit of masculinity ordinately. Do not dismiss it. It's important. It needs to be there. And it needs more recognition than the spirit of femininity, because all of us are feminine with respect to God.
All right. Well, I feel like that's a great place that's a nice bow to tie on this thingy.
Thank you.
So we'll come back next time with another clause of the creed.
Another clause of the creed.
And Petra will see you out.
This has been another episode of the Steel Creed Show, on earth as it is in heaven.